John Dewey was, in many ways, the almost stereotypical American philosopher. He's certainly one of the most famous American thinkers of the 20th century. I say he's stereotypical in the sense that he's intensely democratic, practical, progressive, optimistic, and almost bursting with activity and new projects of reform. There's almost a boosterous nature behind Dewey's work. In addition to his abundant philosophic writings, Dewey wrote on topics as diverse as social criticism, political reform, and pedagogy, all of which had a profound impact on American culture and practice. He's most famous for his instrumentalist version of pragmatism, which really is sort of the American philosophy. And I want briefly to talk a bit about what pragmatism was for James, then his contribution to that tradition, specifically in giving it a historical and historicistic dimension. Then we'll turn to looking at the precise nature of Dewey's historical criticism of traditional philosophy. And once we've achieved that deconstruction, we'll then turn to Dewey's reconstruction, which was, after all, the title of the text we're examining, Reconstruction in Philosophy, and with it the project that he calls for, empiricistic naturalism, and then we'll turn to the impact of empiricistic naturalism for moral and political speculation. Well, as I mentioned in my lecture on James, pragmatism had actually been created by an American logician, Charles Saunders Peirce, as a theory of meaning, and from that had emerged a larger philosophical movement. That theory of meaning had held that the meaning of a statement was the practical results in experience we would expect if that statement were true. These are often referred to as its logical consequences. In philosophy, we saw with James that this served as a method of dissolving arid metaphysical disputes by testing whether there was in fact any practical difference between disputants, and whether their assertions had any meaning in the first place. With this method and theory of meaning was associated a conception of truth, that sentences are true when they are predictive of experience. Since prediction affords us control over the world, theories are true when they work or help us master our natural, social, and cultural environment. And this view was popularized by William James, the famed doctor, psychologist, philosopher, who had popularized the doctrines of Peirce and added a sort of theistic and morally progressive element to them. And while Dewey's instrumentalist pragmatism added some new nomenclature, some new terms to that theory, his real importance for the pragmatic movement lies elsewhere. Dewey's most important contribution was to give pragmatism an historical and historicistic dimension. And there are two reasons I would urge why Dewey was the first pragmatist who was able to do that, to situate pragmatism in a larger historical continuum of philosophic speculation. The first is, unlike James, he actually was a trained professional philosopher. So he was certainly quite aware of the canon. Secondly, and probably more importantly, prior to being a pragmatist, Dewey had been a Hegelian. And therefore, we find in Dewey's work a heavy sort of Hegelian residue. So Dewey's historical defense of pragmatism will include a certain Hegelian element, meaning historicism and a sense of progress. Now, having said that, Dewey's historical defense of pragmatism is in some sense a rather difficult project. And that's because, in a certain way of looking at things, pragmatism is not really a philosophy so much as a kind of anti-philosophy. If we think of traditional philosophy as the classical pursuit of eternal truth and epistemological certainty, as well as a sort of quest for ultimate meaning and being, we see pragmatism doesn't fit within that tradition. It doesn't offer us any metaphysical doctrines or anything answering the description of a serious theory of truth. So in that sense, it's not really a philosophy in that traditional narrow conception. So what Dewey tries to do is to show us how we came to practice traditional philosophy rather than the reasons we might offer either for or against it. then he's able to criticize such doctrines on the basis of their results. Thus, much of Dewey's work takes the form of what we might call a historico-sociological criticism of previous philosophers, and we've seen this before in figures like Nietzsche and Marx. Okay, so let's turn to Dewey's historical interpretation of philosophy. And at the center of Dewey's criticism is his conception of the origins of philosophy, and from that we'll see an emergence of a critique of what he sees as the traditional philosophic fixation with contemplative, or what he calls a spectator view of knowledge. For Dewey, the basic stuff of philosophy is desire and imagination. And we see it most clearly in poetry, drama, and myth in early civilizations. Over time, these cultural phenomena become consolidated in things like religious doctrines, rituals, state practices. Philosophy emerges as a discrete form of discourse when, as in Greece, breakthroughs in mathematics and practical knowledge threaten to undermine these customary beliefs, traditional religion, traditional politics. So what philosophy did, what philosophy's raison d'etre was an attempt to place spiritual and moral values on a new, more rational foundation, and adjust these values to change social and cultural conditions. This Dewey sees as the basic project of not only the sophists, but obviously Plato and Aristotle as well. And it, in Dewey's mind at least, has remained the primary charge of philosophy, in the best, and he means by this non-traditional sense, i.e., philosophy's real goal ought be to show us how things, in a certain sense, hang together, how our religious rituals relate to our scientific beliefs and our political practices. So philosophy shows how they hang together and or how they ought to hang together. Let's turn to that second part of this historical criticism that I mentioned, the spectatorial view of knowledge. For Dewey, this means interpreting knowledge as a relation between, on the one hand, a passive knowing subject who is set apart from an inert world of objects on the other hand. In this situation, knowledge occurs when the subject correctly identifies the properties, characteristics, features, and forms of objects and beings in his or her thought. And we can see this conception in Plato and Aristotle. It originated in their mind for historical reasons, and that's what Dewey wants to explain. Why? What Dewey argues is that Greek society was composed of two broad strata. On the one hand, you had idle aristocrats, who were defined precisely by the fact that they did not labor, they did not produce. They lived a life of, instead, political participation and aesthetic contemplation. On the other hand, the rest of society were made up of those who produced, laborers, artisans, peasants. And their activities were not contemplative or aesthetic, they were purely practical, productive. Given this dichotomy, Dewey argues quite cogently that obviously Plato and Aristotle were of that former class. They were from the idle aristocrats, and Plato himself was a scion of a very wealthy aristocratic family. And as such, it was natural for them to see knowledge as contemplative, as reflective of their own historical and social experience. And Dewey says, if you think about their notion of a spectatorial conception of knowledge, it's very similar to what we would call aesthetic appreciation. The knower is not unlike a Greek aristocrat admiring a beautiful sculpture, work of architect, or even a fine Greek piece of porcelain or a vase. Hence their absorption with the unchanging form of things at the expense of the temporal and malleable. And if you recall, Plato was obsessed with the notion of form, of structure, as opposed to the material nature of things which changed over time. Why? Because what changed was the precinct of the craftsman, of the laborer, who changed things from one form to another. The form, structure of things was what the idle aristocrat experienced in aesthetic apprehension. So what Plato and Aristotle's spectator theory of knowledge showed was that the realm of the craftsman was secondary. in a metaphysical as well as an epistemological sense, since it was, according to Plato, the world of eternal forms and truths were not only superior but more real than that of grubby material realities, those associated with grubby mechanics, those that are part of physis, or nature. Now, this interpretation of the knowledge situation, Dewey believes, was inherited by the medievals and scholastics from the classical era. And it was given a new form in the modern era by René Descartes and his quest for epistemic certainty. A quest which, again, Dewey insists was made from a spectatorial point of view. And for Dewey, this forms the core of contemporary traditional philosophy and has given rise to several unfortunate distinctions and quandaries. And again, to recall Descartes, he argued that, in fact, we are spectators and our minds receive ideas from objects that are inert and external to us. So what are the problems that emerge in the modern epoch from the spectatorial view of knowledge? Well, there's an unfortunate distinction between, on the one hand, a knowing subject, and on the other, the known object. And this gives rise to a larger distinction between subject and object as metaphysical categories. We sort of project that distinction onto the universe at large. And the result is a bifurcated world between, on the one hand, material objects, and on the other, supersensible or supernatural subjects. Dewey points out this is almost always an invidious distinction. It draws us away from the lower, the physical, the material, the extended, towards the higher realm of true being, the unextended, the life of the mind, which is sort of wrapped in an honorific title. Since true knowledge is purely contemplative, as opposed to practical, there emerges a second distinction, that between theory and practice, right? Theory is concerned with capital T truth, while practice is only interested in grubby results. This means that theory has every right to ignore practice. And in fact, theory has no practical results. By contemplating the nature of pure being in itself, theory builds a sort of imaginary world that doesn't suffer from the defects and maladies of our real, lower, practical experience. And again, this is a sort of aristocratic, aesthetic refuge from common life. We escape the unfortunate realities of our social and political life by ascending into the higher realm of pure speculation and contemplation. And the result is that philosophy becomes painfully abstract, and as most lay people feel, it's ultimately irrelevant to their immediate and human concerns. Dewey here shares Marx's famous criticism of this disjunction of theory and practice. And I quote from Marx in his famous thesis on Feuerbach, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Okay. The contemplative vision of knowledge also gives rise to another distinction, especially in the post-Cartesian epoch, of mind and matter, as well as a host of other metaphysical dualisms. Dewey's point is that none of these dualisms are fruitful in any practical sense, right? The distinction between mind and matter doesn't help us develop neurology, it doesn't help us develop cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology, or any sort of practical knowledge. Nor does it help us understand any sort of moral insight. In fact, these distinctions bear no relation to our human situation or practical life. They simply serve to bootstrap us out of nature and onto a higher, more refined plane, where the uncertainties and changes of our world of, quote, becoming are exchanged for a fixed, transcendent realm of being. For Dewey, such metaphysical doctrines are either laughable, as in the case of Descartes' solipsistic ghost in the machine. The question is whether I actually exist or whether anyone else exists. For Dewey, in practical life, this is an absurd suggestion for a philosopher to take seriously. Or they are morally repugnant. And here we might think of Leibniz's famous claim that he had metaphysically established that this was the best of all possible worlds. Well, Leibniz wrote this at the end of the 17th century in Germany, when Western Germany had been literally seeped in a century's worth of blood from religious warfare. To say, after the Palatine had been soaked in the blood of religious disputants, that this is the best of all possible worlds is sort of callous and absurd. Similarly, we might think of Hegel's doctrine that the rational is the real, and that the state is the highest form of moral historical evolution. To say such a doctrine in the early 19th century, when you are in fact supporting a reactionary and militaristic Prussian state, is, for Dewey, an abnegation of a philosopher's moral responsibility. Okay. So the results of traditional philosophy have been to divorce inquiry from actual historical conditions and needs. In that sense, it has moved away from its original purpose and its historical source of existence in ancient Greece. By insisting on eternal truths, it's led us to hold onto moral views that were founded in and for a different era. Because we hold truths to be eternal, we don't change our moral conceptions. For example, Hegel and a host of other 19th century thinkers taught us that the nation-state was the ultimate form of historical community, and its demands exhausted our highest moral duties. Now, in the 19th century, this may have been a tenable view when we were trying to create nation-states. But by the time we get to the 20th century, this leads us to support our particular nations during the First World War, for example, with absolutely disastrous results. The Hegelian moral conception of the nation-state simply doesn't make sense in a world of mustard gas, machine guns, aerial bombing, and tanks. Science has fundamentally changed the world in which we live, but traditional philosophy has been unable to adapt itself or its moral conceptions to this new, changed world. Okay. Now, I want now to turn to the second part of Dewey's project. Having deconstructed the history of philosophy, Dewey then goes on to offer a reconstruction where philosophy ought to go. While pragmatism as a method and doctrine of meaning implies no particular doctrines, Dewey does sketch an overall view of the world that he describes as either naturalistic empiricism or empiricistic naturalism, a phrase that will recur again and when we look at Willard Van Orman Quine. What do we mean by empiricistic naturalism? Well, it's going to be empiricistic because it insists that knowledge both begins and ends in experience, that it must be practical and sensual. It's naturalistic because it treats the world as a natural phenomena, right? And it does so not out of metaphysical scruple, not because he's some sort of hard-shell atheistic materialist, but rather because that is what the most advanced state of our contemporary knowledge tells us. That's what we learn from physics, biology, and chemistry. If physics, biology, and chemistry should teach us something different in the future, we'll certainly change that point of view. So Dewey's naturalistic empiricism, I would urge, has profound implications for the traditional concerns of both epistemology and moral and political philosophy. Well, let's start with epistemology. Dewey wants to replace the traditional epistemic situation of subject and object with a new naturalistic relation. And this will be a relation of organism and environment. As an organism becomes increasingly complex, its relations with its environment become increasingly uncertain and precarious. Because as instinct declines as a guide to action, the range of potential actions increases. And this produces uncertainty and anxiety. Thus, for Dewey, what we would call thought is a biological response to this natural stimulus in a particularly complex organism, Homo sapiens sapiens. Doubt as to what to do next creates a problem. And thought arises to resolve the problems that arise from our relations with our natural and social environment. For Dewey, such thought becomes intellectual when it actually changes the environment to make it more secure and less precarious. Now, it's important to note that Dewey conceives as the natural environment as including not only physical problems and realities, but cultural problems as well. That's one of the implications of naturalism, that culture is part of nature, not a contrast to it. And thus we should find that philosophy is often concerned not only with explaining the nature of being, but also with moral and political problems. Knowledge is thus a sort of mutual relation between organism and environment, and one that is marked by its fruitfulness. Now, For all of his naturalism, Dewey, like all pragmatists, was an epistemological idealist, which is to say he held that we construct the objects of our knowledge. Put another way, he does not believe that the world comes prepackaged into the natural kinds that correspond to our parsing of it in language and concepts. One might think of this in terms of everyday examples. We all speak of directions, north, south, east, and west. But do we believe that nature, without us, comes pre-parsed into a north, south, east, and west? No, we don't. We realize that those are practical forms that we've imposed on experience because they're useful for us. And Dewey simply generalizing that to all of our posits. Our immediate experience is always precognitive. And our conceptions are just that. They're posits that help us resolve the problems of that experience. So then our theories of the world and our parsing of it in those theories are what he calls instruments, or tools for adapting ourselves and the environment. As we develop better tools or concepts, our old ones are dispensed with. And our objects of knowledge change as our parsings change from, say, substances to molecules to atoms to maybe subatomic particles. Dewey's epistemological naturalism also changes the traditional epistemological situation. For example, one of the problems of traditional philosophy had been skepticism, which was the inevitable consequence of that spectatorial view of things. Epistemological naturalism eliminates the problem of skepticism. And this is because skepticism arises because we can never tell, as subjects, if our ideas of the world correspond or copy the nature of objects independently of us. But epistemological naturalism eliminates skepticism because it eliminates that correspondence theory of truth entirely. Right? Things are true if they work. What is known as an object of knowledge, then, isn't a copy of the world or a reflection of reality, but a tool or an instrument that is posited by us to help us resolve some particular problem or fulfill some purpose or agenda. Okay. Again, contrary to traditional philosophy, there are no eternal or immutable truths. Even for Dewey, the truths of mathematics and logic are instrumental. We believe in them because they have worked for us. They're extremely useful, and they continue to work for us. But it's not inconceivable that we might improve on them someday and embrace newer, better ones. We might think of the change in geometry from a flat plane geometry that Euclid proposed to a curved geometry that was developed and actually seems to model the notion of curved space that Einstein had proposed. So I want to sum up this point by saying, contrary to traditional philosophy, for Dewey, epistemological naturalism means that knowledge is not a unique thing, sui generis, but is in fact a natural phenomena between an organism and its environment. Well, Dewey's epistemological naturalism also has, I would urge, extremely profound effects on the practice of moral and political theorizing. Again, Dewey rejects the traditional quest for ultimate ends, that one true value, whether it be Kantian duty or utilitarian pleasure and happiness. Ultimately, what Dewey wants to do is apply that same experimental reasoning that we find in science to ethical problems, which are, in his view, every bit as natural as scientific problems. Okay, how do we do this? Well, we begin with this assumption. Like all animals, humans are, on the one hand, creatures of habit or disposition, and on the other, they are also creatures of impulse. We might think of customs as widely spread uniformities of habit. When we all engage in the same sort of habitual disposition to extend a hand to a stranger, that becomes the custom of shaking hands. As societies change, their customs and institutions sometimes cease to serve the human situation due to changes in the environment. As this tension becomes acute, one or two things can happen. The culture can either fossilize, as happened in New Kingdom Egypt, or impulse will simply break through that cake of custom blindly. And the result will be a violent disruption, like, for example, a political revolution. But if guided by intelligence, that reflective and reflexive rationality, impulse can create new habits, new customs, and new institutions. And in contrast to political revolutions, the analogy would be successful political reforms. For Dewey, this is the fundamental task of a pragmatic ethics, to guide intelligent action in pursuit of an end. Now, while ethics guides action in pursuit of an end, it doesn't itself determine that end. This is important because Dewey argues there are no fixed moral ends. Our ends arise from our culture, from our customs, from our habits. And as a good historicist, as a good disciple of Hegel, he knows they in fact change over time as our needs change and as our circumstances change. So the point is, it's not that we can't identify a value or values. It's rather that we can identify a wide variety of values, and there's no way of lexically ordering them. You want liberty, he wants justice. How are we to say which trumps the other? Nor do these values arise in philosophy. They're not a result of our rational speculations. They arise from life, from experience. And therefore, the philosopher really doesn't have any privileged access to these basic and fundamental values. So instead of trying to reduce all values to one ultimate value, as, say, Kant did, or determine the logical order of their precedence, whether justice or liberty is more important, the philosopher should look at each case as morally unique. Right? He should not expect to find universal solutions. Each moral problem constitutes a domain for speculation which is geared toward a practical solution. What the philosopher can do is point out what the consequences of a particular value would be in a given situation, and then suggest the means to accomplish that project if it is desired. So in this case, ethics is not so much a deductive science or an a priori search for first principles, but it's an intensely practical project, very similar to Aristotle's notion of phronesis, learning to match means to ends. Well, obviously, Dewey does acknowledge that these values and ends are historically contingent. And Dewey, as a creature of early 20th century America, has his own particular ends, which are, I would urge, extremely progressive and democratic. I call them progressive because, like Nietzsche, Dewey had an almost overweening optimism, a Promethean faith in change and growth, that evolution and change and growth were positive and would lead, in fact, to progress. He shares with Nietzsche the view that it's the individual or the individual's character or human nature which is primarily the moral and social object of growth. For Dewey, a person's character is constituted by his habits or his dispositions and the interrelation between those habits and dispositions. Thus, it's important to note Dewey does not believe that human nature is fixed or given. Rather, it needs to be developed. And what develops that is both culture and social environment. So Dewey's end is to promote the development of human character, or human nature, if you will, by reforming social institutions and customs to promote its maturation, integration, and growth. So we might then say that in a certain sense, Dewey is like Nietzsche in that his moral project is really one of self-creation, whereby we try to arrange our world to promote the creation of dynamic, strong, and vital selves. But Dewey's unlike Nietzsche in that he's democratic. He's interested not in the self-creation of a handful of elite Übermensch, but rather in the self-creation and development of every single member of society, not just the privileged or powerful. And this is because the person is always formed by the society, and we are always, thus, a social animal. The ultimate test of any custom or institution, then, is how it contributes to the growth of all persons in any given society. This kind of a Promethean democracy really reminds me of another ex-Hegelian naturalist, Marx, whose communist man also had a sort of fully developed and rounded humanist character. Well, I want to conclude then by saying that Dewey's pragmatism, and really pragmatism in general, is a combination of, in some ways, peculiarly American attitudes towards democracy, work, progress, and science, on the one hand, and a set of philosophical dispositions that constitute a dissenting theme in the modern philosophical genre. It's the American variant of a counter voice within that canon of traditional philosophy, a counter voice that speaks out against the dualisms of subject-object, mind and matter, reason and experience, and most importantly, theory and practice. We might think of this counter canon as perhaps begun by Bacon, pursued by Marx and Nietzsche at the least, all of whom shared a deep and abiding naturalism that stood in stark contrast to the metaphysical idealism and rationalism of the canonical tradition.